The concrete floor was cold against Andrew Chambers' cheek, but he didn't move, didn't flinch when Officer Sean Wallace's boot connected with his ribs for the third time in 10 minutes. "You hear me talking to you, boy?" Wallace spat, his voice echoing off the cell walls. Andrew kept his breathing steady, his eyes fixed on the small recording device hidden in his belt buckle, the same device that had been documenting every word, every kick, every violation for the past 6 weeks. Internal Affairs Detective Andrew Chambers had seen enough, but Sean Wallace was about to learn that sometimes the prey is actually the predator. "What's your state? Have you ever witnessed someone stay silent in the face of injustice, knowing they had a bigger plan? Tell us about a time when patience led to justice in your community." The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the narrow cell that had become Andrew's second home. Cell Block D, Level 3 of the Metropolitan Detention Center, a place where hope came to die, where men were broken down systematically until nothing remained but compliance and fear. At least, that's what Sean Wallace believed. And for 6 weeks, Andrew had played the part perfectly. "I asked you a question," Wallace growled, grabbing Andrew by the orange jumpsuit and hauling him to his feet. The fabric strained against Andrew's shoulders as Wallace slammed him against the concrete wall. The impact sent a shockwave through Andrew's already bruised spine, but his expression remained neutral, controlled, professional, even in this moment of calculated vulnerability. Wallace was everything the Internal Affairs files had said he would be. 6 feet of barely contained rage wrapped in a police uniform that had lost all meaning the day he first decided the badge was a license to hurt rather than protect. His pale blue eyes held the kind of cruelty that came from years of getting away with the unthinkable, and his thick hands moved with the practiced precision of someone who knew exactly how to inflict pain without leaving marks that would show up clearly in photographs. But Andrew had been preparing for this moment his entire career. "Look at me when I'm talking to you," Wallace demanded, his breath hot against Andrew's face. It smelled of stale coffee and the kind of rage that fermented in darkness. Andrew lifted his eyes slowly, meeting Wallace's gaze with the same calm intensity that had gotten him through 15 years of police work, 3 commendations for bravery, and 2 previous undercover assignments that had brought down corrupt operations from the inside. Wallace saw none of that history in Andrew's face. He saw only what Andrew wanted him to see, a broken man who had learned to take whatever punishment was coming his way. "That's better," Wallace said, his voice dropping to the menacing whisper that had terrorized dozens of inmates over the past 5 years. "You're learning. Took you long enough." The recording device pressed against Andrew's ribs, no bigger than a quarter, but worth more than its weight in evidence. Every conversation, every threat, every moment of violence had been captured in digital clarity that would hold up in any courtroom. 6 weeks of documentation that painted a picture so damning that even the most corrupt police union lawyer wouldn't be able to spin it into something defensible. Wallace released his grip on Andrew's jumpsuit and stepped back, rolling his shoulders like a boxer, preparing for another round. The movement was casual, practiced, the kind of physical intimidation that had become second nature to him. He had no idea that every gesture was being analyzed, cataloged, and prepared for presentation to a grand jury that was already waiting to hear the evidence. "You know what I think about you?" Wallace asked, circling Andrew like a predator sizing up wounded prey. "I think you're the kind of guy who thought he was tough on the outside, thought he could handle anything, but in here, you're just another piece of meat waiting to be tenderized." Andrew remained silent, his breathing even and controlled. In the back of his mind, he was already composing the report he would write when this operation concluded. The clinical language he would use to describe Wallace's behavior, the psychological profile that would emerge from weeks of careful observation. Wallace wasn't just a corrupt officer, he was a sadist who had found the perfect environment to feed his need for control and violence. "I'm talking to you." Wallace's voice rose, and his hand shot out to grab Andrew's throat. The fingers pressed against Andrew's windpipe with enough force to make breathing difficult, but not enough to leave bruises that would raise questions during the next routine medical check. Wallace had learned the boundaries of his cruelty through years of practice, staying just within the lines that would keep his victims alive and his actions deniable. Andrew's training kicked in automatically. He knew 17 different ways to break Wallace's grip, 12 methods of incapacitating an attacker of Wallace's size and build, and at least 6 legal justifications for using deadly force in this situation. But instead, he simply endured. Because Detective Andrew Chambers wasn't here to fight Sean Wallace. He was here to destroy him completely. "Please," Andrew whispered, his voice carefully modulated to sound broken and desperate. "I didn't do anything wrong." Wallace's laugh was sharp and bitter. "Didn't do anything wrong? You exist. That's wrong enough for me." He released Andrew's throat and stepped back, satisfied with the fear he thought he was seeing. "You people think you can just walk through life like you own the place, like you deserve the same respect as real Americans." The words hit Andrew like physical blows, but not because they hurt, because they were exactly what Internal Affairs had been waiting to hear. The kind of language that would prove pattern and intent, that would demonstrate this wasn't just excessive force, but motivated by racial hatred. The kind of evidence that would guarantee Wallace spent the rest of his career defending himself in civil rights lawsuits instead of hiding behind a badge. "I don't want any trouble," Andrew said, maintaining his cover even as part of him wanted to stand up and show Wallace exactly what kind of trouble he was actually dealing with. "Too late for that," Wallace replied, cracking his knuckles with deliberate menace. "Trouble found you the day you decided to breathe the same air as decent people." Andrew's hand moved almost imperceptibly, adjusting the recording device to ensure optimal audio pickup. The movement was so slight that Wallace didn't notice, too focused on his own performance of dominance to pay attention to the details that would eventually convict him. "You want to know what I think?" Wallace continued, his voice taking on the conversational tone of someone sharing a casual observation. "I think the world would be a better place if people like you just disappeared. Quietly, without making a fuss, without anyone having to explain where you went or why." The threat was clear, and Andrew felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with genuine danger. Wallace wasn't just a bully. He was someone who had convinced himself that violence was not only justified but necessary. The kind of officer who saw his badge as permission to act on the darkest impulses that most people spent their lives suppressing. "I understand," Andrew said quietly, his voice carrying just the right note of resignation. "Good," Wallace nodded, apparently satisfied with Andrew's submission. "As long as we understand each other, we won't have any more problems." But even as he spoke, Wallace's eyes held the promise of future violence. This wasn't the end of anything. It was just the beginning of a campaign of terror that would continue until one of them broke. Wallace had no way of knowing that Andrew had already won, that every word of this conversation was being transmitted to a team of federal investigators who were building an airtight case against him. The cell door clanged shut behind Wallace as he left, the sound echoing through the concrete corridors like a death knell. Andrew remained standing against the wall for several minutes after Wallace disappeared, waiting for his heartbeat to return to normal, waiting for the adrenaline to clear his system enough for him to think clearly. When he was certain he was alone, Andrew allowed himself a small smile. 6 weeks of playing the victim, 6 weeks of taking beatings and swallowing his pride, 6 weeks of pretending to be powerless while systematically gathering the evidence that would bring down not just Wallace but the entire network of corruption that had allowed him to operate with impunity. Andrew Chambers had spent his entire career hunting predators. He'd worked gang infiltration in Detroit, organized crime in Chicago, and domestic terrorism cases that had taken him from coast to coast. But this assignment was different. This time, he was hunting his own kind, the officers who had betrayed everything the badge was supposed to represent. The recording device continued its silent work, documenting the aftermath of violence, the sound of Andrew's controlled breathing, the distant echoes of other prisoners dealing with their own versions of hell. All of it would be part of the record, part of the story that would eventually be told in a courtroom where Sean Wallace would learn what it felt like to be powerless. Andrew moved slowly to his narrow bunk, each step a reminder of the physical cost of his investigation. The bruises would heal, the memories would fade, but the evidence would remain. Digital perfection that captured not just the words and actions, but the tone, the context, the systematic nature of the abuse. As he lay down on the thin mattress, Andrew thought about the other inmates he'd met during his weeks undercover. Men like Jerome Washington, a 22-year-old arrested for marijuana possession who had been beaten so severely by Wallace that he'd lost hearing in his left ear. Marcus Thompson, a 40-year-old construction worker who'd been jailed for unpaid traffic tickets and had spent 3 days in solitary confinement after Wallace claimed he'd been disrespectful. Their stories would be part of the case too. Andrew had carefully documented each victim, each incident, each piece of evidence that demonstrated Wallace's pattern of targeting black inmates for special treatment, the kind of systematic abuse that federal civil rights laws were specifically designed to address. The lights in the cell dimmed automatically as the detention center shifted to its nighttime routine. Andrew closed his eyes and listened to the sounds of the facility settling into uneasy sleep. Distant conversations, the occasional shout or cry, the mechanical hum of systems designed to keep human beings locked away from the world. Tomorrow would bring another day of playing his role, another opportunity for Wallace to reveal more of his true nature, another 24 hours of evidence gathering that would strengthen the case against him. But tonight, Andrew allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The prey had been marked, the trap had been set, and the hunter was closing in for the kill. Sean Wallace had no idea that his career was already over, that his freedom was already forfeit, that his reputation was already destroyed. He was still operating under the assumption that power came from fear, that authority meant the right to brutalize anyone who couldn't fight back. Andrew Chambers was about to teach him a very different lesson about the true nature of power, the kind that came from patience, from preparation, from the absolute certainty that justice would eventually find its way to even the darkest corners of the system. The recording device hummed quietly against his ribs, a mechanical heartbeat that counted down the hours until Sean Wallace's world would collapse completely. And Andrew smiled in the darkness, knowing that sometimes the best revenge was simply giving someone enough rope to hang themselves and making sure every moment of their downfall was captured in perfect digital clarity. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the Internal Affairs Division, casting long shadows across the polished conference table where Detective Andrew Chambers sat reviewing a file that would change everything. The manila folder in front of him was thick with complaints, incident reports, and testimonies that painted a picture so disturbing that even veteran investigators had struggled to believe it was happening within their own department. Captain Sarah Rodriguez entered the room with the purposeful stride of someone who had spent 23 years climbing the ranks of a system that hadn't always welcomed her presence. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe bun that emphasized the sharp intelligence in her brown eyes, and her pressed uniform bore the kind of creases that spoke to military precision and uncompromising standards. "Detective Chambers," she said, settling into the chair across from him with a heavy sigh. "Thank you for coming in early. I know this wasn't how you planned to spend your morning." Andrew looked up from the file, his expression serious but not surprised. He'd been working internal affairs for 5 years, long enough to recognize the weight that seemed to settle on Captain Rodriguez's shoulders whenever she was about to ask one of her detectives to risk everything in pursuit of justice. "Captain," he replied, closing the folder carefully. "When you called last night, you said this was priority 1. I'm guessing it's not a routine misconduct investigation." Rodriguez leaned back in her chair, studying Andrew with the kind of assessment that came from years of evaluating whether someone was ready for assignments that could destroy careers or end lives. "Sean Wallace," she said simply, letting the name hang in the air between them. Andrew nodded slowly. Wallace's reputation had preceded him through the department like a toxic cloud. 5 years of complaints, dozens of excessive force allegations, and a pattern of behavior that suggested someone who saw his badge as a license to inflict pain rather than serve justice. But somehow Wallace had managed to avoid serious consequences, protected by a network of supervisors who either looked the other way or actively covered for him. "He's been untouchable so far," Andrew observed, his voice carefully neutral. "Union protection, friendly supervisors, witnesses who suddenly develop amnesia when it comes time to testify. What's changed?" Rodriguez reached into her briefcase and pulled out a digital tablet, its screen displaying a photograph that made Andrew's jaw tighten involuntarily. A young black man, maybe 19 years old, lying in a hospital bed with facial injuries so severe that his own mother might have trouble recognizing him. Terrence Williams, Rodriguez said quietly, arrested last month for alleged drug possession. According to the arresting officer's report, he became combative during booking and had to be subdued. According to the medical examiner, his injuries are consistent with being beaten with a baton while restrained. Andrew studied the photograph, his trained eye cataloging the systematic nature of the damage. This wasn't the result of a brief struggle or a moment of lost control. Someone had taken their time, inflicting precise injuries designed to cause maximum pain and humiliation, the kind of methodical violence that suggested a predator who enjoyed his work. This wasn't random violence, he said. Someone took their time. Wallace was the lead officer on the arrest, Rodriguez continued. But here's what makes this different. Terrence's sister works for the district attorney's office. She's not going to be intimidated into silence, and she's not going to accept the standard explanations about resisting arrest. The implications were clear. For years, Wallace had operated in the shadows, targeting people who couldn't fight back, people whose complaints would be dismissed or buried in bureaucratic procedures. He'd built his reputation on the backs of victims who had no voice, no platform, no way to make the system listen. But now he had made a critical mistake. He had hurt someone whose family had both the knowledge and the resources to demand real accountability. So we're finally going to get him, Andrew said. But Rodriguez shook her head. It's not that simple, she replied. Wallace is smart. He's careful about documentation, careful about witnesses, careful about making sure his stories line up with his partners. Even with Terrence Williams's case, we're looking at competing narratives and limited physical evidence. Andrew frowned, sensing that there was more to this conversation than a single assault case. Rodriguez had the look of someone who had been carrying a heavy burden for too long, someone who had watched injustice flourish while her hands were tied by procedural requirements and legal technicalities. What are you not telling me, Captain? Rodriguez stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city that stretched beyond the police headquarters. The view encompassed neighborhoods where Wallace had operated with impunity, communities where trust in law enforcement had been systematically eroded by officers who saw their badges as weapons rather than symbols of service. We've been watching Wallace for months, she said. Surveillance, financial records, communication intercepts. What we've found suggests that he's not working alone. There's a network of officers who are covering for each other, sharing information, coordinating their activities. A conspiracy, Andrew said. The word carrying implications that extended far beyond individual misconduct. Exactly. And the only way we're going to break it is from the inside. Rodriguez turned back to face Andrew, her expression grave. We need someone to go undercover. Someone who can document what's really happening in that detention center. Someone who can gather evidence that will hold up in federal court. The silence that followed was heavy with understanding. Andrew had worked undercover before: gang infiltration in Detroit, organized crime in Chicago, domestic terrorism cases that had taken him from coast to coast. But this was different. This was asking him to infiltrate his own profession, to become prey in an environment where the predators wore the same uniform he'd worn with pride for 15 years. You want me to get myself arrested, Andrew said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what was being asked. We want you to become one of Wallace's victims, Rodriguez corrected. We want you to experience firsthand what he does to people who can't defend themselves. And we want every moment of it documented in ways that will stand up to legal scrutiny. Andrew was quiet for a long moment, considering the implications. Going undercover as a criminal meant surrendering his identity, his protection, his ability to call for backup if things went wrong. It meant trusting that his colleagues would be able to extract him before permanent damage was done, and it meant accepting that some damage might be unavoidable. The physical risks were obvious: broken bones, internal injuries, the kind of systematic brutality that Wallace had perfected over years of practice. But the psychological risks might be even greater. Maintaining cover while being tortured required a level of mental discipline that few people possessed, and the line between playing a victim and becoming one was thinner than most people realized. What's the cover story? He asked finally. Rodriguez returned to her seat, pulling out another file that contained what would become Andrew's fictional criminal history. The documents were expertly crafted, complete with arrest photos, fingerprint records, and a paper trail that would satisfy even careful scrutiny. Andrew Carter, small-time drug dealer with a history of resisting arrest, multiple priors for possession with intent to distribute, known to be uncooperative with authority figures. The kind of person Wallace typically targets for special attention. Andrew studied the fabricated arrest record, noting the careful attention to detail that would make his cover story believable. The fictional Andrew Carter was everything that would trigger Wallace's predatory instincts. Young, black, defiant, and without the resources or connections to fight back effectively. And the extraction plan? 6 weeks maximum, Rodriguez said. Long enough to establish patterns and gather substantial evidence, short enough to minimize the physical and psychological risks. You'll be equipped with recording devices that are completely undetectable, and you'll have a predetermined signal system for emergency extraction. 6 weeks. It sounded like a manageable time frame, but Andrew knew that 6 weeks of systematic abuse could feel like a lifetime. 6 weeks of maintaining perfect cover while enduring whatever Wallace chose to inflict. 6 weeks of appearing weak and broken while maintaining the mental clarity necessary to gather evidence that would stand up in court. What about backup? Detective Maria Santos will be your primary contact, Rodriguez explained. She'll be monitoring all transmissions and coordinating with federal investigators who are standing by to move when we have sufficient evidence. Agent Jennifer Collins from the FBI's Civil Rights Division is leading the federal task force, and she's committed full resources to this investigation. Andrew nodded, recognizing Santos as one of the most competent investigators in the division. If anyone could keep him safe while he was in the field, it would be her. Santos had a reputation for thorough preparation and careful execution, exactly the kind of professional he needed watching his back during such a dangerous assignment. There's something else you need to know, Rodriguez continued, her voice dropping to a more serious tone. Wallace has killed before. We can't prove it, but there have been 2 suspicious deaths in custody over the past 3 years. Inmates who died of supposed medical complications, but whose injuries suggested something more sinister. The weight of that information settled over Andrew like a cold shadow. This wasn't just about gathering evidence of misconduct. It was about stopping someone who might be a serial killer, operating under the protection of a police badge. The detention center had become Wallace's personal hunting ground, a place where he could satisfy his need for violence while hiding behind the authority of law enforcement. Marcus Johnson, 26, died of what was officially ruled a heart attack, Rodriguez said, reading from another file. But the autopsy showed signs of blunt force trauma to the chest and abdomen. Timothy Rodriguez, no relation, died of a brain hemorrhage that could have been caused by repeated head trauma. Both were in Wallace's custody when they died. Andrew felt a chill run down his spine. If Rodriguez was right, then Wallace wasn't just a corrupt officer. He was a predator who had learned to kill with impunity. And Andrew was volunteering to become his next potential victim. When do we start? Andrew asked, his decision already made, despite the risks. Rodriguez smiled grimly. Your arrest is scheduled for tomorrow night. Santos will be working with narcotics to set up a controlled buy operation that will give us probable cause. By this time Thursday, you'll be Andrew Carter, and your real life will effectively disappear until we bring you home. Andrew stood and shook Rodriguez's hand, feeling the firmness of her grip and the weight of her trust. Captain, I need you to know if things go wrong in there, if Wallace figures out who I really am, you'll handle it, Rodriguez said with quiet confidence. You've never failed to complete an assignment, and I don't expect you to start now. Just remember, this isn't about heroics. This is about gathering evidence and getting out alive. The justice comes afterward. As Andrew left the conference room, his mind was already shifting into the mental space he would need to survive the next 6 weeks. Andrew Chambers, the decorated detective with 15 years of exemplary service, would have to disappear completely. In his place would emerge Andrew Carter, a man with nothing to lose and everything to prove. The transformation wouldn't be easy. It would require him to suppress every instinct that had kept him alive through years of dangerous police work, to become vulnerable when every fiber of his being screamed for him to fight back. But it was the only way to get close enough to Wallace to document the full extent of his crimes. That evening, Andrew sat in his apartment, looking at photographs of his 8-year-old daughter Maya, and thinking about the kind of world he wanted to leave for her. A world where badges meant protection instead of threat, where justice applied equally regardless of race or economic status, where corrupt officers couldn't hide behind institutional protection when they betrayed their oaths. Maya's latest school picture showed her bright smile and curious eyes, the same eyes that looked at him with complete trust and admiration. She believed her father was a hero, someone who made the world safer for people like her. Andrew wanted to make sure that belief was justified, that when she grew up, she would inherit a system that truly served and protected everyone. Sean Wallace represented everything that was wrong with policing, everything that made good officers look bad, everything that eroded public trust in the institutions that were supposed to serve and protect. Bringing him down wouldn't solve all the problems, but it would send a message that no one was above the law, not even those who were sworn to enforce it. Andrew packed away the photographs and began the mental preparation that would carry him through the most dangerous assignment of his career. He reviewed his cover story until it became second nature, practiced the mannerisms and speech patterns that would make Andrew Carter believable, and mentally rehearsed the techniques that would help him maintain his sanity while enduring systematic abuse. The recording devices were already being prepared by the technical support team, microscopic transmitters that could be sewn into clothing, hidden in personal effects, or even surgically implanted under the skin. The extraction plans were being finalized by Santos and her team, with multiple contingencies for different scenarios. The federal prosecutors were being briefed on what evidence they would need to guarantee convictions that would put Wallace and his associates away for decades. Everything was ready except for Andrew himself, and he spent the remaining hours before his arrest, ensuring that he was prepared for whatever Sean Wallace might throw at him. He knew the statistics on police brutality, understood the psychological profiles of officers who abused their authority, and had studied the methods that predators used to break down their victims. But knowing about violence and experiencing it were two very different things. Tomorrow night, Andrew would cross a line that few law enforcement officers ever had to cross. He would voluntarily surrender his power, his protection, and his identity to become the kind of victim he had spent his career trying to protect. The irony wasn't lost on him. In order to serve justice, he would have to experience injustice. In order to protect the innocent, he would have to become vulnerable. In order to stop a predator, he would have to become prey. But he was ready. 15 years of police work had taught him that justice often required sacrifice, that protecting the innocent sometimes meant putting yourself in harm's way, and that the badge meant nothing if you weren't willing to risk everything to honor what it represented. Tomorrow, Detective Andrew Chambers would disappear, and Andrew Carter would take his first steps into a world where survival depended on appearing weak while maintaining the strength to gather the evidence that would bring justice to everyone Wallace had ever hurt. The game was about to begin, and Andrew was ready to play his part perfectly. The handcuffs bit into Andrew's wrists as the transport van lurched through the city streets toward the Metropolitan Detention Center. 48 hours ago, he had been Detective Andrew Chambers, sitting in his comfortable office reviewing case files and planning his daughter's birthday party. Now he was Andrew Carter, a small-time drug dealer with a history of violence and a freshly minted arrest record that would make him exactly the kind of target Sean Wallace preferred. The transformation had been more thorough than Andrew had anticipated. The wardrobe department had provided clothes that looked like they'd been worn hard and washed infrequently, jeans with strategic tears, a faded t-shirt that smelled of cigarettes and desperation, sneakers that had seen too many miles on unforgiving streets. His appearance had been altered with temporary tattoos, scars created with theatrical makeup, and a haircut that changed the entire shape of his face. But the physical transformation was nothing compared to the mental shift required to become Andrew Carter. Detective Chambers was confident, authoritative, accustomed to being the one asking questions and demanding answers. Andrew Carter was angry, defensive, suspicious of authority, and quick to interpret any interaction as a potential threat. The character had been built from psychological profiles of repeat offenders, men who had learned to see the world as fundamentally hostile and every police officer as an enemy. "Enjoy the ride, Carter," said Officer Mike Brennan, the arresting officer who was playing his role with convincing authenticity. "Once you get where you're going, things are gonna get real educational, real fast." Andrew glared at Brennan through the mesh barrier, letting Andrew Carter's natural hostility surface in his expression. "Yeah, well, you ain't gonna be there to protect me, so maybe keep your mouth shut." Brennan laughed, a sound that carried genuine menace despite being part of the performance. "Protect you? Brother, you got it backwards. I'm the one who's gonna make sure they know exactly what kind of problem you are. Good luck with that attitude inside." The van pulled through the gates of the detention center, and Andrew felt his heart rate increase despite his training. The facility loomed ahead like a concrete fortress, its high walls topped with razor wire that glinted in the afternoon sun. This was where Sean Wallace ruled his private kingdom, where he had operated with impunity for years while systematically brutalizing anyone who couldn't fight back. The intake process was designed to break down whatever dignity or self-respect new inmates might have retained. Andrew was strip-searched, deloused, photographed from every angle, and subjected to a series of humiliating procedures that reduced him from a person to a number in the system. Through it all, he maintained Andrew Carter's sullen defiance, responding to questions with minimal cooperation and just enough attitude to mark him as a problem case. Carter, Andrew J., read the intake officer, a tired-looking woman who had clearly processed thousands of men just like him. Drug possession with intent to distribute, resisting arrest, assault on a police officer. Says here, you tried to bite Officer Brennan during the takedown. Andrew said nothing, letting his silence speak louder than any denial. The assault charge was fabricated, part of the cover story designed to make him seem dangerous enough to warrant special attention from officers like Wallace. In reality, the arrest had been carefully choreographed to avoid any actual injury while creating the appearance of a violent struggle. "Cat got your tongue?" the officer asked, looking up from her paperwork, with the kind of weary irritation that came from dealing with uncooperative inmates all day. "You might want to work on that attitude, Carter. Officers here don't take kindly to disrespect." "I ain't disrespecting nobody," Andrew replied, his voice carrying Andrew Carter's particular blend of defensiveness and challenge. "Just trying to mind my own business." The officer snorted. "Mind your own business? You tried to sell drugs to an undercover cop, then attacked the arresting officer. That's not minding your business. That's being stupid." Andrew shrugged, the gesture conveying exactly the kind of casual indifference that would mark him as someone who needed to be taught respect. He was walking a careful line, appearing defiant enough to attract Wallace's attention without seeming so dangerous that he would be placed in isolation where he couldn't gather evidence. After intake, Andrew was escorted to Cell Block D, Level 3, exactly where Internal Affairs Intelligence had indicated Wallace spent most of his time. The corridor was narrow and poorly lit, lined with cells that housed men who had learned that survival meant keeping their heads down and their mouths shut. The air smelled of industrial disinfectant mixed with something darker: fear, hopelessness, and the lingering residue of violence. "Fresh meat," called out someone from one of the cells as Andrew was led past. "Hope you're ready for the welcome wagon." Andrew's escort, a young officer named Patterson, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, stopped at Cell 47. "This is home, Carter. Try not to make trouble for yourself." The cell was 8 feet by 10 feet, containing a narrow bunk, a small metal toilet, and a sink that had seen better decades. The walls were concrete painted institutional green, marked with scratches and stains that told stories Andrew didn't want to think about too carefully. A small barred window near the ceiling provided the only natural light, casting shadows that shifted throughout the day like a primitive sundial. Andrew's cellmate was already lying on the lower bunk, a thin black man in his 40s, who looked up with eyes that had seen too much. He had the careful, measured movements of someone who had learned to telegraph his intentions clearly, avoiding any gesture that might be misinterpreted as threatening. "Name's Jerome." The man said quietly after Patterson left. "Jerome Washington, you're the new fish they've been talking about." "Andrew Carter," Andrew replied, settling onto the upper bunk and trying to get a read on his cellmate. "What they been saying?" Jerome sat up slowly, his movements suggesting old injuries that hadn't healed properly. "That you got an attitude problem, that you disrespected the arresting officer. Around here, that means you're gonna get special attention from Officer Wallace." The name hung in the air between them like a curse. Andrew could see the fear that flickered across Jerome's face when he spoke it, the automatic tension that suggested conditioned response to a consistent threat. "Wallace?" Andrew asked, playing ignorant while filing away every detail of Jerome's reaction. "Sean Wallace," Jerome said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "He runs things on this level. Been here 5 years, and in all that time, I ain't never seen nobody cross him and walk away the same." Andrew felt the recording device against his ribs, already documenting Jerome's testimony about Wallace's reign of terror. This was exactly the kind of evidence internal affairs needed. First-hand accounts from victims who had experienced Wallace's brutality directly. "What's his deal?" Andrew pressed, careful to maintain Andrew Carter's casual curiosity rather than showing the focused interest of a trained investigator. Jerome glanced toward the cell door, checking to make sure they weren't being overheard. "He likes to hurt people, especially black people, especially people who don't show him the respect he thinks he deserves. And he's got friends who make sure nobody ever reports what he does." Friends? Other officers, guards, people in the administration. You file a complaint against Wallace. It disappears. You try to contact a lawyer. Your calls get lost. You tell your family what's happening. Suddenly your visiting privileges get suspended for disciplinary violations nobody can explain. Andrew nodded, filing away the information about systematic cover-ups and institutional protection. This wasn't just about one corrupt officer. It was about an entire network designed to shield Wallace from accountability while he terrorized inmates with impunity. "How long you been here?" Andrew asked. 8 months, Jerome replied. "Drug possession. Should have been out in 90 days. But Wallace made sure I got written up for enough violations to extend my sentence. Fighting, contraband, disrespect to officers, all bullshit. But it goes on your record anyway. And you just take it?" Jerome's laugh was bitter and tired. "You think I got a choice? First week I was here, I tried to stand up to him. Told him I knew my rights, that he couldn't treat people like animals. You know what he did?" Andrew waited, knowing the answer would be another piece of evidence in the case against Wallace. "Put me in solitary for 2 weeks. Said I threatened an officer. When I got out, he made sure I understood that was just a taste of what he could do if I ever opened my mouth again. Then he showed me Marcus Johnson's cell." "Who's Marcus Johnson?" "Was," Jerome corrected. "Marcus was a guy who tried to fight back. Big guy, thought he could handle Wallace and his crew. They found him dead in his cell 3 months ago. Official cause was heart attack. But Marcus was 26 years old and healthy as a horse when he came in." Another piece of the puzzle fell into place. Marcus Johnson was one of the suspicious deaths Captain Rodriguez had mentioned, and Jerome's account suggested it wasn't natural causes that killed him. "You think Wallace killed him?" Jerome was quiet for a long moment, the silence heavy with fear and unspoken knowledge. "I think Marcus made the mistake of believing his life mattered to people who see us as less than human. And I think Wallace made sure that mistake didn't spread to the rest of us." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of heavy footsteps in the corridor, followed by the jangle of keys and the harsh scrape of metal on metal. Jerome's entire body tensed, and he quickly lay back down on his bunk, closing his eyes and pretending to sleep. "Looks like the welcome wagon's here," he whispered without opening his eyes. Andrew's pulse quickened, but he forced himself to remain calm. This was what he had come here for: direct contact with Sean Wallace. Everything that happened next would be recorded, analyzed, and used to build the case that would finally bring Wallace to justice. The cell door opened with a loud clang, and 3 officers entered. Andrew recognized Wallace immediately from the surveillance photos. 6 feet tall, built like someone who spent serious time in the gym, with pale blue eyes that held the cold calculation of a practiced predator. He was flanked by 2 other officers who carried themselves with the casual arrogance of people who knew they could act with impunity. "Well, well," Wallace said, his voice carrying the mock friendliness that predators often used before revealing their true nature. "Andrew Carter, heard you had some problems with Officer Brennan during your arrest." Andrew sat up on his bunk, meeting Wallace's gaze with the kind of defiant stare that Andrew Carter would use. "Didn't have problems with nobody. Just minding my own business when y'all decided to get all aggressive." Wallace smiled, and Andrew felt a chill run down his spine. It was the smile of someone who enjoyed inflicting pain, someone who had learned to find pleasure in the suffering of others. "Minding your own business," Wallace repeated. "That what you call selling drugs to undercover cops? That what you call trying to bite a police officer?" "I call it surviving," Andrew replied, letting Andrew Carter's natural hostility surface, something you probably don't know nothing about. The 2 officers flanking Wallace tensed, reading his response as a direct challenge to their authority. But Wallace just continued smiling, apparently delighted to have found someone who would provide him with the kind of resistance that made breaking them more satisfying. "Officer Martinez, Officer Thompson," Wallace said to his companions without taking his eyes off Andrew. "I think Mr. Carter here needs some education about how things work in my facility." Martinez, a stocky man with scarred knuckles, stepped forward. "Want us to take him to the education room, Sergeant?" "Not yet," Wallace replied. "First, I want to make sure he understands the rules. Carter, stand up." Andrew hesitated for just a moment, long enough to convey reluctance without appearing outright defiant. He stood slowly, his posture suggesting someone who was preparing for trouble but wasn't quite ready to start it. "Rule number 1, Wallace said, circling Andrew like a predator sizing up prey. "In here, I am God. I decide who eats, who sleeps, who gets medical attention, and who gets punished. You got a problem with that?" "Nah," Andrew replied, his voice carefully neutral. "No problems here." "Good," Wallace said. "Rule number 2, respect is earned through obedience. You do what you're told, when you're told, without question or complaint. You think you can handle that?" Andrew nodded, knowing that anything more than minimal compliance would make Andrew Carter seem weak and uninteresting to Wallace. "Rule number 3, Wallace continued, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Complaints, legal challenges, and outside interference are not tolerated. You try to cause problems for me or my officers, and you'll learn that there are consequences that don't appear in any official report." The threat was clear and direct, exactly the kind of intimidation that federal prosecutors would love to hear in Wallace's own voice. Andrew's recording device captured every word, every inflection, every nuance that would help build the case against him. "We understand each other?" Wallace asked. "Yeah," Andrew said, "we understand each other." Wallace studied Andrew's face for a long moment, apparently trying to determine whether he was dealing with someone who would submit quietly, or someone who would require more aggressive persuasion. "I don't think you do," Wallace said finally. "I think you're the kind of person who needs a practical demonstration before the lesson really sinks in." Without warning, Wallace's fist shot out, connecting with Andrew's solar plexus with enough force to double him over. The blow was precise and practiced, designed to cause maximum pain without leaving visible marks. Andrew gasped, fighting to maintain his composure, while Andrew Carter's natural response would be shock and outrage. "That's lesson 1, Wallace said calmly as Andrew struggled to catch his breath. "Lesson 2 comes tomorrow, after you've had time to think about whether you really understand the rules." Wallace and his officers left the cell, locking the door behind them with a finality that echoed through the concrete corridor. Andrew remained doubled over for several moments, partly from the genuine pain of the blow, and partly to give Andrew Carter time to process what had just happened. Jerome sat up on his bunk, his expression mixing sympathy with resignation. "Welcome to hell," he said quietly. "Hope you're ready for the full tour." Andrew straightened slowly, his hand moving to adjust the recording device that had captured Wallace's assault and threats. Day 1 was complete, and he already had evidence that would support federal charges, but he also knew that this was just the beginning. Wallace was testing him, probing for weaknesses, determining how much abuse he could inflict before Andrew broke completely. The next 6 weeks would test every limit of Andrew's endurance, every technique he had learned for surviving in hostile environments, every ounce of determination that had carried him through 15 years of police work. But as he settled back onto his bunk, Andrew felt a grim satisfaction. Sean Wallace had just made his first mistake. He thought he was breaking down another victim, but he was actually providing evidence to the very person who would bring him to justice. The hunter didn't know he was being hunted, and that ignorance would ultimately destroy him. The game had begun in earnest, and Andrew was ready to play it through to the end. 2 weeks into his undercover assignment, Andrew had documented 17 separate incidents of abuse by Sean Wallace and his crew. Each morning brought new evidence of systematic brutality, and each evening found Andrew carefully transmitting his findings to Detective Santos through the encrypted communication system hidden in his recording equipment. The pattern that emerged was more disturbing than even Internal Affairs had anticipated. Wallace didn't operate randomly. His violence was calculated, methodical, designed to break down specific types of inmates while maintaining plausible deniability. He targeted black men almost exclusively, focusing on those who showed any sign of education, dignity, or resistance to his authority. The goal wasn't just compliance, it was complete psychological destruction. Andrew's cellmate Jerome had become an unwitting source of institutional memory, sharing stories that painted a picture of Wallace's 5-year reign of terror. During their whispered conversations after lights out, Jerome revealed details that would have been impossible for investigators to uncover from the outside. "See, Wallace don't just beat people," Jerome explained one night, his voice barely audible in the darkness. "That's amateur hour. He studies you first, figures out what makes you tick, then he goes after whatever matters most." "What do you mean?" Andrew asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Take Deshaun Williams. Young kid, maybe 22, came in for shoplifting, real smart, talking about how he was going to finish college when he got out, how he was going to make something of himself. Wallace heard that and decided Deshaun needed humbling. Jerome paused, the silence heavy with unspoken trauma. First, Wallace made sure Deshaun got classified as a security risk, moved him to isolation. Then he started the mind games, told Deshaun his girlfriend was cheating on him, showed him fake pictures of her with other men, told him his family had stopped visiting because they were ashamed of him. Andrew felt his jaw tighten. Psychological torture was harder to document than physical abuse, but it could be just as devastating to victims. What happened to him? Deshaun tried to kill himself 3 weeks ago, hung himself with a bedsheet in his cell. Wallace found him, cut him down, saved his life, then wrote himself up for a commendation for preventing an inmate's suicide. The recording device captured every word, adding another layer to the case against Wallace. But Andrew also felt the weight of what he was hearing. Real people whose lives had been destroyed by a predator hiding behind a badge. "He saves them?" Andrew asked, confused by the apparent contradiction. "Part of the game," Jerome replied. "Wallace pushes people to the breaking point, then swoops in to save them when they try to hurt themselves. Makes him look like a hero to the administration while terrorizing the inmates." Perfect cover. Andrew filed away the information, recognizing it as evidence of sophisticated psychological manipulation that went far beyond simple brutality. Wallace had turned the detention center into his personal laboratory for experimenting with human suffering. The next morning brought Andrew's first experience with Wallace's special attention program. During breakfast, Officer Martinez approached Andrew's table with the casual menace that had become Wallace's signature calling card. "Carter," Martinez said loudly enough for nearby inmates to hear, "Sergeant Wallace wants to see you in his office." Andrew stood slowly, aware that every eye in the cafeteria was watching him. The other inmates knew what a summons to Wallace's office usually meant, and their expressions ranged from sympathy to relief that they weren't the ones being called. Wallace's office was located in the administrative section of the facility, down a corridor lined with motivational posters about rehabilitation and respect that seemed obscenely ironic given what actually happened there. The office itself was neat and professional looking, decorated with commendations and photographs that portrayed Wallace as a dedicated public servant. "Sit down, Carter," Wallace said without looking up from the paperwork on his desk. He was wearing reading glasses that made him look almost scholarly, a carefully cultivated image that probably helped him avoid scrutiny from supervisors who preferred to see corruption as a failure of individual character rather than systematic institutional rot. Andrew sat in the chair across from Wallace's desk, noting the positioning that forced him to look up at Wallace, while Wallace looked down at him. Every detail of the office was designed to reinforce the power dynamic between officer and inmate, between authority and subject. "How are you adjusting to life here?" Wallace asked, his tone conversational, but with underlying menace that suggested the wrong answer would have consequences. "Fine," Andrew replied, keeping his response minimal. Wallace finally looked up from his paperwork, studying Andrew with the cold calculation of someone evaluating a piece of property. "Fine. That's interesting, because I've been hearing reports that you're not integrating well with the other inmates." Andrew frowned, genuinely confused. He had been careful to maintain friendly but distant relationships with other prisoners, avoiding conflicts that might interfere with his investigation. "What kind of reports?" "Antisocial behavior," Wallace said, reading from a file that Andrew suspected contained entirely fabricated entries. "Refusing to participate in group activities, showing disrespect to correctional staff, making other inmates uncomfortable with your aggressive attitude." Each allegation was carefully crafted to justify increased scrutiny and punishment, while being impossible to definitively prove or disprove. Andrew recognized the technique from his own interrogation training: create a narrative that puts the subject on the defensive, then use their denials as evidence of further deception. "I ain't been aggressive with nobody," Andrew said, letting Andrew Carter's natural defensiveness surface. "Are you calling me a liar?" Wallace asked, his voice dropping to the dangerous whisper that inmates had learned to fear. Andrew hesitated, recognizing the trap. Agreeing with Wallace's false allegations would be seen as admission of guilt, but challenging them would be interpreted as disrespect that warranted punishment. "No, sir," Andrew said finally. "Just saying, I don't remember it that way." Wallace smiled, apparently satisfied with Andrew's response. Memory can be tricky in stressful situations. Maybe some additional structure would help you focus better. He pulled out a form and began filling it out with practiced efficiency. "I'm recommending you for the Enhanced Supervision Program. Daily counseling sessions, restricted movement, limited recreational privileges should help you develop better coping mechanisms." Andrew knew the Enhanced Supervision Program was Wallace's cover for systematic harassment. Inmates enrolled in the program were subjected to constant scrutiny, frequent searches, and regular counseling sessions that were actually opportunities for psychological abuse. "How long does the program last?" Andrew asked. "As long as it takes," Wallace replied. "Some inmates respond quickly to structured intervention. Others require more intensive treatment." The threat was clear, and Andrew's recording device captured every nuance. Wallace was essentially telling him that he would be subjected to ongoing abuse until he was completely broken, or until Wallace grew bored with him. "Anything else?" Andrew asked. Wallace leaned back in his chair, apparently enjoying the power dynamic he had created. "Actually, yes. I'm curious about your background, Carter. Your arrest report mentions previous convictions, but there are some gaps in your history that don't quite add up." Andrew felt a chill of genuine fear. Had Wallace discovered something that compromised his cover? Internal Affairs had been meticulous in creating Andrew Carter's fictional history, but experienced investigators sometimes developed instincts for detecting deception. "What kind of gaps?" Andrew asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Your educational background, for instance," Wallace said, pulling out another file. "According to your intake interview, you dropped out of high school at 16, but your vocabulary and speech patterns suggest someone with more formal education." The observation was perceptive and dangerous. Andrew had been careful to modify his speech patterns to match Andrew Carter's background, but apparently not careful enough to fool someone who was actively looking for inconsistencies. "I read a lot," Andrew said, hoping the explanation would satisfy Wallace's suspicions. In jail libraries? Wallace asked, with obvious skepticism. Books is books, Andrew replied, deliberately using grammar that reinforced his cover story. Wallace studied him for a long moment, and Andrew could practically see the gears turning in his mind. He was clearly suspicious, but not yet convinced that Andrew was anything other than what he appeared to be. "We'll be keeping a close eye on you, Carter," Wallace said finally. "I have a feeling you're more interesting than you want people to believe." Andrew left Wallace's office with the uncomfortable knowledge that his cover might be more fragile than he had realized. Wallace was intelligent and observant, qualities that made him effective as both a predator and a potential threat to Andrew's investigation. Over the following days, Andrew experienced the full scope of Wallace's enhanced supervision program. Daily counseling sessions that were actually interrogations designed to find cracks in his story, frequent cell searches that were really opportunities for guards to destroy personal possessions and plant contraband, meals that arrived cold or not at all, justified by claims that Andrew had violated minor regulations. But the program also provided Andrew with unprecedented access to Wallace's methods and associates. He documented how Officer Thompson specialized in sleep deprivation techniques, keeping targeted inmates awake for days at a time through strategic use of welfare checks and facility inspections. He recorded Officer Martinez's expertise in creating injuries that looked accidental, bruises from falls during transport, cuts from defective equipment, burns from malfunctioning fixtures. Most disturbing was the systematic nature of the operation. Wallace had created detailed files on every inmate under his supervision, tracking their psychological vulnerabilities and physical limitations. He knew which inmates had family members they cared about, which ones were struggling with mental health issues, which ones were most likely to break under different types of pressure. "He's like a scientist," Jerome observed after witnessing one of Andrew's returns from a counseling session, "studying us like lab rats, figuring out the best ways to make us suffer." Andrew nodded, too exhausted to respond verbally. The physical abuse was taking its toll, but the psychological pressure was even more challenging. Maintaining Andrew Carter's persona while enduring systematic torture required a level of mental discipline that pushed him to his limits. But the evidence he was gathering was extraordinary. Every conversation with Wallace revealed new details about the scope of his corruption. Every interaction with other officers demonstrated how the conspiracy operated. Every day in the enhanced supervision program provided documentation that would be devastating in court. 3 weeks into his assignment, Andrew had recorded evidence of 17 civil rights violations, 12 instances of assault under color of authority, and at least 6 cases of conspiracy to obstruct justice. He had documented Wallace's psychological torture techniques, his network of corrupt associates, and his systematic targeting of black inmates. But he had also pushed his cover to its breaking point. Wallace's suspicions were growing, and Andrew wasn't sure how much longer he could maintain the Andrew Carter persona under increasingly intense scrutiny. The crisis came during a routine cell inspection that turned into something much more dangerous. Wallace arrived with 4 officers instead of the usual 2, and his demeanor was different, more focused, more predatory, like someone who had finally decided to drop all pretense. "Strip search," Wallace announced without preamble. "Full cavity inspection. We've received reports that Carter here is hiding contraband." Andrew's blood ran cold. A thorough search would discover his recording equipment, ending his investigation and potentially ending his life. Wallace's smile suggested he knew exactly what such a search would reveal. "What kind of contraband?" Andrew asked, stalling for time while his mind raced through possible escape scenarios. "The kind that explains how a supposed high school dropout knows words like pursuant and jurisdiction," Wallace replied. "The kind that might help us understand why someone with your background seems so comfortable talking to authority figures." The trap was closing, and Andrew realized he might have to choose between maintaining his cover and preserving his life. Either way, Sean Wallace was about to discover that his latest victim was far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. The recording device continued its silent work, documenting what might be the final moments of the most dangerous undercover operation in internal affairs history. In a few minutes, Andrew would either find a way to escape detection, or Sean Wallace would learn that he had been hunting a hunter all along. The pattern that had emerged over 3 weeks of careful documentation was about to be tested in the most dangerous way possible, and Andrew wasn't sure if his preparation would be enough to survive what came next. The 4 officers surrounded Andrew in his cell, like wolves circling wounded prey. Wallace stood in the doorway, his pale blue eyes gleaming with the anticipation of someone who believed he was about to solve a puzzle that had been bothering him for weeks. The air was thick with tension and the kind of predatory excitement that came from the prospect of inflicting pain with complete impunity. "You know what I think, Carter," Wallace said, his voice carrying the conversational tone of someone discussing the weather. "I think you're not who you claim to be. I think maybe we need to take a much closer look at exactly what you're hiding." Andrew's mind raced through his options, none of them good. The recording device was sewn into the lining of his jumpsuit, positioned where it would be discovered during any thorough search. His emergency extraction signal would take at least 20 minutes to activate a response, and he wasn't sure he had 20 seconds before Wallace's suspicions turned into actionable intelligence. "I ain't hiding nothing," Andrew said, letting Andrew Carter's natural defensiveness surface while he calculated distances and angles. 4 officers in a small cell meant limited mobility, but it also meant they would interfere with each other if he could force them to move simultaneously. "Strip," Wallace commanded, his smile widening. "Everything off, now." Andrew hesitated, and that moment of delay was exactly what Wallace had been waiting for. In his experience, innocent inmates complied immediately with strip search orders, either from habit or from fear of the consequences of resistance. Only someone with something to hide would pause to consider their options. "Problem, Carter?" Wallace asked, taking a step into the cell. "Suddenly shy about showing off your body? That's not what your arrest report says about you." The other officers laughed, a sound that held more menace than humor. They had clearly done this before, participated in the systematic humiliation and abuse that Wallace used to break down inmates who caught his attention. But Andrew could see something different in their eyes today, a heightened alertness that suggested they suspected this search might reveal more than the usual contraband. "Maybe he's got some fancy underwear he don't want us to see," suggested Officer Martinez, cracking his knuckles with deliberate menace. "Rich boy trying to slum it with the real criminals." Andrew began unbuttoning his jumpsuit slowly, buying time while his mind worked through increasingly desperate scenarios. Every second he delayed increased Wallace's suspicions, but moving too quickly might appear suspicious in its own way. He needed to find a balance between compliance and the natural reluctance any inmate would show to being strip-searched. "Faster," Wallace ordered, his patience clearly wearing thin. "We don't have all day for your modesty show." As Andrew removed his jumpsuit, he positioned himself near the cell door, hoping to create some angle that might allow him to protect the recording device. But Wallace was too experienced to fall for such obvious misdirection. "Thompson, Martinez, hold him," Wallace commanded. "Let's make sure he doesn't try anything stupid while we conduct our inspection." Officers Thompson and Martinez moved to grab Andrew's arms, and he found himself facing the moment of truth. In seconds, they would discover the recording equipment, and his investigation would be over. Worse, Wallace would realize he had been documenting everything, and Andrew wasn't sure he would survive the revelation. But as Thompson reached for his left arm, Andrew heard something that changed everything. The distant sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor, accompanied by voices that carried the authority of rank. Someone was coming, and Wallace apparently recognized the voices because his expression shifted from predatory anticipation to professional concern. "Hold up," Wallace said quietly, raising his hand to stop his officers. "We've got company." The voices grew closer, and Andrew could make out at least 3 different speakers, engaged in what sounded like an official inspection tour. One voice carried the unmistakable authority of senior administration, while another had the clipped precision of someone from outside the facility. "Shit," Martinez whispered. "That's Warden Hawkins. What's he doing down here?" Wallace's jaw tightened with frustration, but he was too smart to continue an unauthorized strip search with the warden in the area. If his suspicions about Andrew were correct, he needed to be certain he could control the aftermath of any discovery. Getting caught conducting unauthorized searches while senior officials were touring the facility would raise exactly the kind of questions he had spent years avoiding. "Get dressed," Wallace hissed at Andrew, his voice carrying a promise of future consequences. "This isn't over, Carter. Not by a long shot." Andrew pulled his jumpsuit back on with hands that were steadier than they had any right to be, given how close he had come to complete exposure. The recording device remained safely hidden, and his cover was intact for now. But he could see in Wallace's eyes that the reprieve was temporary. The voices in the corridor grew closer, and Wallace quickly arranged his officers in positions that would make their presence appear routine. By the time Warden Hawkins appeared in the doorway, flanked by two people Andrew didn't recognize, Wallace was projecting the professional competence of a dedicated correctional officer conducting a routine cell inspection. "Sergeant Wallace," Warden Hawkins said, his tone neutral but clearly expecting an explanation. "What's the situation here?" "Routine welfare check, sir," Wallace replied smoothly. "Inmate Carter here has been having some adjustment difficulties, and we wanted to make sure he's adapting appropriately to the facility's expectations." Andrew recognized the performance for what it was: Wallace's ability to shift seamlessly between predator and professional whenever external scrutiny appeared. It was probably the skill that had allowed him to operate with impunity for so long. "Mr. Carter," said one of the people with Warden Hawkins, a woman with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. "I'm Inspector Sarah Chen from the State Department of Corrections. How are you finding your accommodations here?" The question was clearly routine, part of a standard inspection protocol. But Andrew realized it might also be an opportunity to plant seeds of information that could prove useful later. "It's been educational," Andrew replied carefully, choosing his words to convey multiple meanings. "Real educational." Inspector Chen nodded, apparently satisfied with his response. But Andrew noticed that she made a note on her clipboard, suggesting that his words had registered as potentially significant. "Carry on, Sergeant Wallace," Warden Hawkins said. "We'll continue our tour." As the inspection party moved down the corridor, Wallace's expression shifted back to the cold calculation that Andrew had learned to fear. The interruption had saved Andrew from immediate exposure, but it had also clearly intensified Wallace's suspicions. "You're a lucky man, Carter," Wallace said once the officials were out of earshot. "But luck runs out eventually, and when it does, I'll be right here waiting." After Wallace and his officers left, Andrew collapsed onto his bunk, the adrenaline finally catching up with him. Jerome, who had remained silent throughout the entire encounter, finally spoke. "You almost got caught," Jerome observed quietly. "Whatever you're hiding, Wallace is getting close to figuring it out." Andrew nodded, recognizing that his cellmate had developed an acute sensitivity to the dynamics of power and danger that governed life in the facility. "What do you think he suspects?" "That you're not what you seem," Jerome replied. "Could be you're an informant for another agency. Could be you're undercover law enforcement. Could be you're just someone with more education and intelligence than your arrest record suggests. Doesn't matter what the truth is. Wallace will keep digging until he finds something." The assessment was accurate and troubling. Andrew had managed to maintain his cover for 3 weeks, but Wallace's growing suspicions meant that his remaining time was probably measured in days rather than weeks. That night, Andrew used his encrypted communication system to send an emergency status report to Detective Santos. The message was brief but urgent. "Cover compromised. Extraction may be necessary soon. Request guidance." The response came back within an hour. "Federal prosecutors need 2 more weeks minimum for airtight case. Can you maintain cover?" Andrew stared at the message for several minutes before responding. "Will attempt. Stand by for emergency extraction signal." 2 more weeks. It seemed like an eternity when every day brought new risks of exposure. But Andrew also understood the importance of building a case so comprehensive that no corrupt police union lawyer could find loopholes or technicalities to exploit. The next morning brought a new level of harassment that confirmed Andrew's worst fears about Wallace's intentions. Instead of the usual routine of meals and recreation periods, Andrew found himself subjected to a series of special procedures that were clearly designed to break down his resistance and create opportunities for surveillance. "Medical examination," announced Officer Thompson, appearing at Andrew's cell with a wheelchair that suggested the examination would not be taking place in the facility's normal medical bay. Andrew was wheeled to a small room in the administrative wing, where a man in a white coat waited with equipment that looked more like interrogation tools than medical instruments. The examination was thorough and invasive, clearly designed to search for hidden devices or evidence of deception. "Unusual scarring pattern," the pseudo-doctor observed, examining Andrew's hands under a magnifying glass. "These calluses suggest someone who's done physical labor, but not the kind typically associated with street-level drug dealing." Andrew's heart sank. His hands bore the calluses of someone who had spent years at shooting ranges and in police training facilities, subtle evidence of his real profession that he hadn't thought to disguise. "Muscle development is also interesting," the doctor continued. "Suggests systematic physical training rather than the random activity patterns typical of career criminals." Each observation was another nail in the coffin of Andrew's cover story. Wallace had clearly brought in someone with expertise in detecting deception, and that person was systematically dismantling the fictional identity that Internal Affairs had worked so hard to create. But the examination also provided Andrew with crucial intelligence about the scope of Wallace's operation. The fake doctor's expertise suggested that Wallace had access to resources and personnel beyond what should have been available to a sergeant in a county detention facility. Someone was providing him with support that indicated corruption at levels far higher than Internal Affairs had suspected. After the examination, Andrew was returned to his cell with the knowledge that his cover was hanging by threads. Wallace knew he was dealing with someone who wasn't what they appeared to be, and it was only a matter of time before he discovered the truth. That evening, Jerome shared information that made the situation even more dire. "Word is that Wallace has put out feelers," Jerome said quietly, "checking with contacts in other facilities, seeing if anyone knows anything about an Andrew Carter with your description." Andrew felt his stomach drop. If Wallace was conducting background checks through unofficial channels, he would eventually discover that Andrew Carter's criminal history didn't extend beyond the carefully crafted records that Internal Affairs had created. "How long before he gets answers?" Andrew asked. "Couple days, maybe less," Jerome replied. "Wallace has connections everywhere. Used to work in 3 different facilities before he came here, and he's got friends in all of them." The timeline had just accelerated dramatically. Andrew had perhaps 48 hours before Wallace's network uncovered the holes in his cover story. After that, his investigation would be over, and his life would be in serious danger. But those 48 hours might also be his last opportunity to gather the evidence that would finally bring Wallace to justice. Despite the risks, Andrew decided to push his luck one more time, to probe deeper into Wallace's operation while he still had the chance. The next morning, Andrew made a decision that violated every principle of safe undercover work. Instead of trying to avoid Wallace's attention, he deliberately provoked a confrontation that would either provide the final pieces of evidence Internal Affairs needed or expose his true identity in the most dangerous way possible. "Sergeant Wallace," Andrew called out during the morning meal distribution, his voice carrying across the cafeteria with deliberate challenge. "I got a question about the Enhanced Supervision Program." Every conversation in the cafeteria stopped. Inmates and officers alike turned to stare at Andrew, recognizing that he had just crossed a line that no one crossed without serious consequences. Wallace's smile was cold and predatory as he approached Andrew's table. "What kind of question, Carter?" "The kind that maybe other people should hear the answer to," Andrew replied, meeting Wallace's gaze with the steady confidence of someone who had finally decided to stop pretending to be afraid. The confrontation that followed would either provide the evidence that destroyed Sean Wallace's career or result in Andrew's exposure as an undercover officer. Either way, the breaking point had finally arrived, and there was no turning back. The cafeteria fell silent as Sean Wallace approached Andrew's table, his footsteps echoing off the concrete floor with the measured precision of someone who had perfected the art of intimidation. Every inmate in the room understood they were witnessing something unprecedented, a direct challenge to Wallace's authority that would either end in complete capitulation or spectacular violence. "You want to ask questions about the enhanced supervision program?" Wallace said, his voice carrying the deceptively calm tone that experienced inmates had learned to fear more than shouting. "That's interesting, Carter. Most people in your position are more concerned with survival than policy discussions." Andrew felt the weight of every eye in the cafeteria, knowing that his next words would either provide the final evidence Internal Affairs needed or trigger a confrontation that could end his investigation permanently. But 3 weeks of systematic abuse had pushed him to a point where Andrew Carter's natural defiance and Detective Chambers' professional outrage had merged into something dangerous. "Just wondering if there's supposed to be actual supervision involved," Andrew replied, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "Or if it's just an excuse for guards to work out their personal problems on inmates who can't fight back." The challenge was unmistakable, and Wallace's smile widened with genuine pleasure. He had been waiting for Andrew to drop his defensive posture and reveal whatever hidden strength had been sustaining him through weeks of abuse. "Careful, Carter," Wallace said, circling Andrew's table like a predator evaluating prey. "That sounds awfully close to criticism of facility policies. We have procedures for dealing with inmates who develop attitude problems." "I bet you do," Andrew said, maintaining eye contact with Wallace while his recording device captured every word. "Probably the same procedures you used on Marcus Johnson and Timothy Rodriguez." The mention of the 2 dead inmates sent a ripple of shock through the cafeteria. No one talked about the suspicious deaths that had occurred under Wallace's watch, partly from fear and partly from the understanding that asking questions about dead inmates was a quick way to join them. Wallace's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, the predatory smile fading into something colder and more calculating. "Those men died of natural causes, Carter. Medical complications that had nothing to do with their treatment here." "Natural causes," Andrew repeated, letting skepticism color his voice. 26-year-old healthy men just dropping dead from heart attacks and brain hemorrhages. Must be something in the water. The accusation hung in the air like a challenge that couldn't be ignored. Wallace was being forced to choose between backing down in front of his subordinates and escalating to a level of violence that might be difficult to explain to his superiors. "Officer Martinez, Officer Thompson," Wallace said without taking his eyes off Andrew, "I think Mr. Carter needs some private counseling about appropriate respect for facility policies." But before his officers could move, Andrew played his final card, the one piece of information that would either destroy Wallace or get Andrew killed in the attempt. "Before you do that," Andrew said, his voice carrying the authority he had been hiding for 3 weeks, "maybe you should know that everything you've said and done for the past month has been recorded. Every threat, every assault, every violation of these men's civil rights, all of it documented in ways that will hold up in federal court." The silence that followed was absolute. Wallace's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and finally a cold rage that suggested Andrew had just signed his own death warrant. "What did you say?" Wallace asked, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Andrew reached into his jumpsuit and pulled out the small recording device, holding it up where everyone could see it. The device was no bigger than a coin, but in that moment, it represented 3 weeks of evidence that could destroy Wallace's career and send him to federal prison. "Internal Affairs Detective Andrew Chambers," Andrew said, dropping Andrew Carter's defensive posture and speaking with the full authority of his real identity. "You're under investigation for civil rights violations, conspiracy, assault under color of authority, and murder." The revelation hit the cafeteria like a bomb. Inmates who had learned to stay invisible suddenly found themselves staring at someone who had voluntarily placed himself in their position to gather evidence against their tormentors. Officers who had participated in Wallace's systematic abuse realized they had been documenting their own crimes for weeks. Wallace's hand moved instinctively toward his service weapon, but the presence of dozens of witnesses prevented him from taking any action that would be impossible to explain later. Instead, he stood frozen, his mind clearly racing through the implications of what he had just heard. 3 weeks, Andrew continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the cafeteria. 3 weeks of documentation that proves you've been running this facility like your personal torture chamber. Every inmate you've brutalized, every officer you've corrupted, every crime you've committed while hiding behind that badge. You're lying, Wallace said, but his voice lacked conviction. The evidence was right there in Andrew's hand, and they both knew it contained enough recorded conversations to destroy him completely. Am I? Andrew asked, pressing a button on the device that activated its playback function. Wallace's own voice filled the cafeteria, crystal clear and unmistakably incriminating. Rule number 1 in here. I am God. I decide who eats, who sleeps, who gets medical attention, and who gets punished. The recording continued for several seconds, playing back Wallace's threats and racial slurs with perfect digital clarity. Every word was evidence of systematic abuse. Every phrase was proof of the corruption that had allowed Wallace to operate with impunity. Wallace lunged for the recording device, but Andrew was ready for him. 3 weeks of playing the victim had required him to suppress every defensive instinct, but now he could finally respond with the full training and experience of 15 years of police work. Andrew sidestepped Wallace's charge and used his momentum to send him crashing into a nearby table. The impact sent food trays flying and created enough chaos to mask Andrew's next move, activating the emergency extraction signal that would bring backup racing to his location. Officers Martinez and Thompson, Andrew said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who was no longer pretending to be powerless. You're also under federal investigation. I strongly recommend you remain exactly where you are and avoid making any moves that might be interpreted as threatening a federal officer. But Wallace wasn't finished. As he struggled to his feet, his face was twisted with the kind of rage that came from realizing he had been outsmarted by someone he had considered inferior. You think you're clever? Wallace snarled, pulling out his radio. You think you can just walk in here and destroy everything I've built? I've got connections you can't imagine, protection that goes all the way to the top. I'm counting on it, Andrew replied, holding up the recording device again. Because every connection you reveal, every person you try to contact for help, just adds another name to the conspiracy charges. The sound of approaching sirens indicated that Andrew's extraction signal had been received and backup was on the way. But Wallace's next words revealed just how deep the corruption ran and how dangerous the situation was about to become. Unit 47 to control, Wallace said into his radio, his voice shifting to the professional tone he used for official communications. We have a security situation in the cafeteria. Inmate has taken a hostage and is making threats against staff. Request immediate tactical response. Andrew realized with cold clarity that Wallace was about to rewrite the narrative completely. By the time backup arrived, Andrew would be portrayed as a dangerous inmate who had somehow obtained a weapon and was threatening officers. The recording device would be dismissed as contraband, and Andrew's true identity would be buried under a mountain of fabricated charges. Control to Unit 47. Came the response over Wallace's radio. Tactical team is en route. Maintain safe distance and do not engage until backup arrives. But Wallace had no intention of waiting for backup. He was already moving toward Andrew with the determined stride of someone who had decided that the only way to survive this situation was to eliminate the threat completely. Last mistake you'll ever make, Carter, Wallace said, his hand moving toward his service weapon, despite the presence of witnesses. Andrew knew he had only seconds before Wallace crossed the line from corruption to outright murder. The recording device in his hand contained evidence that could destroy Wallace's entire network, but only if Andrew survived long enough to deliver it to federal prosecutors. The cafeteria erupted into chaos as inmates dove for cover and officers tried to position themselves for whatever was about to happen. In the midst of the confusion, Andrew made a decision that would either save his life or end it. He threw the recording device to Jerome Washington, who caught it with the reflexes of someone who had learned to react quickly to survival situations. "Get that to Detective Santos," Andrew shouted over the noise. "Internal Affairs, Metropolitan Police Department. Tell her Detective Chambers says the package is complete." Wallace spun toward Jerome, realizing that the evidence was now beyond his immediate reach. But before he could take any action, the first wave of Andrew's backup burst through the cafeteria doors. Federal agents wearing tactical gear and carrying weapons that made Wallace's service pistol look like a toy. "Federal agents," shouted the lead officer, a woman Andrew recognized as FBI agent Jennifer Collins from the Civil Rights Division. "Everyone on the ground, now." Wallace found himself facing a choice between surrender and a gunfight. He couldn't possibly win. For a moment, it seemed like he might choose the gunfight anyway, his hand still hovering near his weapon, as he calculated odds that were clearly impossible. "Sergeant Wallace," Agent Collins called out, her weapon trained on him with professional precision. "Step away from Detective Chambers and place your hands behind your head." The use of Andrew's real identity seemed to break the last of Wallace's resistance. He realized that the federal government had been planning this operation for weeks, that his corruption had attracted attention at levels far beyond what he had imagined possible. Wallace's hands moved slowly away from his weapon, and he placed them behind his head with the mechanical obedience of someone whose world had just collapsed completely. Around the cafeteria, other officers who had participated in his conspiracy were being placed under arrest with efficient professionalism. As federal agents secured the scene, Andrew felt the adrenaline finally catching up with him. 3 weeks of playing the victim, 3 weeks of enduring systematic abuse, 3 weeks of maintaining perfect cover while gathering evidence that would destroy one of the most corrupt operations in the history of American law enforcement. "Detective Chambers," Agent Collins said, approaching him with a medical kit. "Are you injured? Do you need immediate medical attention?" Andrew shook his head, though he knew the physical and psychological toll of his undercover assignment would take weeks to fully assess. "I'm fine, but we need to secure all the inmates who witnessed this. They're going to be crucial witnesses, and Wallace's network might try to retaliate." "Already handled," Collins replied. "We've been monitoring your transmissions for weeks, and we've identified everyone who needs protection. Jerome Washington and the other inmates who helped document Wallace's crimes are going into protective custody tonight." As Wallace was led away in handcuffs, he turned back toward Andrew with a look of pure hatred. "This isn't over, Chambers. You have no idea how deep this goes, how many people you've just made very angry." "I'm looking forward to finding out," Andrew replied, meeting Wallace's gaze with the calm confidence of someone who had just completed the most dangerous assignment of his career. "Because every person who comes forward to threaten me is just going to add their name to the list of defendants." The recording device that Jerome still clutched in his hands contained more than 3 weeks of evidence. It contained the complete documentation of a systematic conspiracy that had operated with impunity for years, and it would serve as the foundation for a federal prosecution that would reshape how corruption was investigated and punished in law enforcement. As Andrew was escorted out of the detention center for the last time, he thought about the inmates he was leaving behind, men like Jerome, who had endured years of abuse while maintaining their dignity and humanity in an environment designed to strip both away. Their testimony would be crucial to ensuring that Wallace and his associates faced the full consequences of their crimes. The evidence had mounted for 3 weeks, and now it would be presented to a federal grand jury that would determine whether justice could finally penetrate the institutional protection that had shielded Sean Wallace for so long. Andrew had survived his assignment, but the real test would come in the courtroom, where the recordings and testimony would either prove strong enough to convict or insufficient to overcome the resources and connections that corrupt officers use to escape accountability. But as he looked back at the detention center one final time, Andrew felt confident that justice would finally be served. The evidence was overwhelming, the conspiracy was exposed, and Sean Wallace's reign of terror was over. 6 months after Andrew's extraction from the Metropolitan Detention Center, Federal District Court Room 7 had become the stage for one of the most significant police corruption trials in recent history. The mahogany-paneled courtroom was packed with reporters, civil rights activists, law enforcement officials, and family members of Wallace's victims, all waiting to see whether justice would finally penetrate the institutional protection that had shielded corrupt officers for decades. Sean Wallace sat at the defendant's table, his orange prison jumpsuit, a stark contrast to the police uniform he had worn with such arrogance for 15 years. The man who had once terrorized inmates with impunity now found himself in the position he had forced on so many others, powerless, exposed, and facing the full weight of a system that had turned against him. His expensive defense team, led by Richard Blackwood, surrounded him like a fortress of legal expertise, bought with money that federal investigators suspected came from sources far beyond a sergeant's salary. Andrew sat in the witness section, wearing a crisp suit that marked his return to his identity as Detective Andrew Chambers. The physical injuries from his undercover assignment had healed, but the psychological scars remained, hidden beneath a professional demeanor that had been hardened by 3 weeks of systematic abuse. During the months of preparation for this trial, he had undergone extensive debriefing sessions with FBI psychologists, federal prosecutors, and internal affairs investigators who needed to understand every detail of what he had experienced and documented. The media attention had been overwhelming. Andrew's story had become national news, inspiring debates about police accountability, the ethics of undercover operations, and the systematic nature of corruption in law enforcement. Editorial writers praised his courage, while critics questioned whether the ends justified the means. But sitting in that courtroom, surrounded by the victims whose suffering he had shared, Andrew knew that every moment of pain had been worth it if justice could finally be served. "The prosecution calls Detective Andrew Chambers to the stand," announced Assistant U.S. Attorney Sarah Martinez, whose reputation for prosecuting civil rights violations had made her the federal government's top choice for this case. Martinez had spent 15 years building cases against corrupt officials, and she understood that this trial would either demonstrate the system's ability to police itself or expose its failure to hold bad actors accountable. Andrew stood and walked to the witness stand, feeling the weight of every eye in the courtroom. Jerome Washington sat in the front row, his presence a reminder of the real victims whose suffering had made this prosecution possible. Behind him sat Marcus Johnson's mother, a woman whose grief had been transformed into determination to see her son's death properly investigated. Timothy Rodriguez's family occupied the row behind her, their faces reflecting years of unanswered questions about their loved one's suspicious death. The families of other victims filled the remaining seats, relatives of men who had been brutalized, psychologically tortured, or mysteriously injured while in Wallace's custody. Some had traveled from other states, drawn by the possibility that this trial might finally provide answers to questions that had haunted them for years. After being sworn in, Andrew faced the prosecutor with the calm confidence of someone who had spent months preparing for this moment. The recording device that had captured 3 weeks of evidence sat on the prosecution table, a small piece of technology that contained enough incriminating material to destroy Wallace's entire network. Beside it lay hundreds of pages of transcripts, photographs of injuries, medical records, and expert analysis that painted a comprehensive picture of systematic abuse. "Detective Chambers," Martinez began, "please tell the court about your assignment to investigate Sergeant Sean Wallace." Andrew's testimony began with the briefing from Captain Rodriguez, the careful construction of his cover identity, and the deliberate decision to place himself in Wallace's custody. As he spoke, he could see members of the jury leaning forward, fascinated by the detailed planning that had gone into the investigation. The operation had required coordination between multiple agencies, approval from federal judges, and oversight from internal affairs supervisors who understood the risks involved. The decision to go undercover wasn't made lightly, Andrew explained. Traditional investigation methods had failed to penetrate the wall of silence that protected Sergeant Wallace. Complaints from inmates were routinely dismissed, witnesses were intimidated into retracting their statements, and physical evidence was either destroyed or explained away through fabricated incident reports. Martinez guided Andrew through the transformation process, the creation of Andrew Carter's criminal history, the staged arrest that provided his cover story, and the psychological preparation required to maintain his false identity under extreme stress. The jury listened with obvious fascination as Andrew described the challenge of suppressing 15 years of police training while appearing to be a vulnerable criminal. Can you describe for the jury the conditions you encountered in the Metropolitan Detention Center? Martinez asked. Systematic brutality, Andrew replied without hesitation. Sergeant Wallace had created an environment where inmates, particularly black inmates, were subjected to physical and psychological torture as a matter of routine policy. It wasn't random violence. It was calculated, methodical, designed to break down specific individuals while maintaining plausible deniability. Wallace's defense attorney stood to object. Your Honor, the witness is characterizing alleged misconduct rather than testifying to specific facts. Sustained, Judge Patricia Hawthorne replied. Detective Chambers, please limit your testimony to what you personally observed. Judge Hawthorne had a reputation for running a tight courtroom, but she also understood the significance of this case. Her rulings had consistently favored the prosecution when defense attorneys tried to exclude evidence or limit testimony, recognizing that the systematic nature of the alleged crimes required comprehensive documentation to establish patterns of behavior. Andrew nodded and began detailing the specific incidents he had witnessed and experienced. Each assault, each threat, each violation of basic human dignity was documented with the precision of someone who had trained himself to remember every detail that might prove crucial in court. He described the first night's beating, the systematic humiliation during counseling sessions, and the calculated psychological torture that Wallace used to break down inmates' resistance. On my first night in custody, Andrew testified, Sergeant Wallace struck me in the solar plexus while explaining what he called the rules of the facility. He stated, and I quote, "In here I am God. I decide who eats, who sleeps, who gets medical attention, and who gets punished." Martinez activated the recording device, and Wallace's own voice filled the courtroom with perfect digital clarity. The jury leaned forward, hearing for the first time the arrogant declaration that would become the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. Several jurors visibly recoiled at the casual cruelty in Wallace's tone, the obvious pleasure he took in describing his power over vulnerable people. Did Sergeant Wallace make other statements about his authority over inmates? Martinez asked. Yes, Andrew replied. During multiple encounters, he made it clear that he considered inmates, particularly black inmates, to be subhuman. He used racial slurs, made threats about making people disappear, and described inmates as animals who needed to be trained through violence. The recording device played back hours of Wallace's statements, each one more damning than the last. The jury heard him laughing about inflicting pain, bragging about his ability to avoid consequences, and coordinating with other officers to cover up their crimes. The recordings captured not just individual acts of brutality, but the systematic nature of the operation Wallace had created. One particularly damaging recording featured Wallace explaining his philosophy to Officer Martinez. These people need to understand that resistance is futile. Break them down completely, and they become compliant. Compliant inmates don't file complaints, don't cause problems, and don't make us look bad to the administration. Wallace's attorney tried desperately to challenge the admissibility of the recordings, arguing they had been obtained through deception and violated his client's rights. But Judge Hawthorne had already ruled during pre-trial hearings that undercover investigations conducted by law enforcement were perfectly legal, and that Wallace had no expectation of privacy while committing crimes in his official capacity. Detective Chambers, Martinez continued, did you witness Sergeant Wallace's treatment of other inmates? Andrew's testimony turned to the systematic abuse he had documented. Jerome Washington's case provided a perfect example of Wallace's methods. The fabricated violations that extended sentences, the psychological torture designed to break down resistance, the careful application of violence that left minimal physical evidence. Mr. Washington was serving a 90-day sentence for drug possession, Andrew testified. Sergeant Wallace extended that sentence to 8 months through a series of manufactured disciplinary violations. When Mr. Washington tried to file complaints about his treatment, Wallace placed him in solitary confinement and told him that people who complain have a way of disappearing permanently. Jerome nodded from the gallery, his presence validating Andrew's testimony and providing a human face to the systematic abuse that Wallace had perfected over years of practice. During the months since the investigation concluded, Jerome had become an advocate for prison reform, speaking at conferences and legislative hearings about the need for better oversight of correctional facilities. Andrew then described other victims he had encountered. Deshaun Williams, the young man who had attempted suicide after Wallace's psychological torture. Carlos Mendez, an immigrant who had been beaten so severely that he still walked with a limp. Robert Taylor, an elderly veteran who had been denied medical care as punishment for requesting to speak with a chaplain. Each case followed the same pattern, Andrew explained. Wallace would identify inmates who showed signs of education, dignity, or resistance to his authority. He would then systematically destroy them through a combination of physical violence, psychological manipulation, and institutional retaliation. The prosecution then turned to the most serious charges, the deaths of Marcus Johnson and Timothy Rodriguez. Andrew testified about the culture of violence that Wallace had created, the way he pushed inmates to psychological breaking points, and the suspicious circumstances surrounding both deaths. Did Sergeant Wallace ever make statements about inmates who had died in custody? Martinez asked. Yes, Andrew replied. When discussing Marcus Johnson, Wallace said, and I quote, "Johnson learned what happens when you try to be tough in my house. Some lessons are permanent." He also made reference to problem inmates who had been permanently solved through methods that didn't appear in official reports. The recording of those statements sent a visible shockwave through the courtroom. Even Wallace's attorney seemed shaken by the callous indifference his client had shown toward young men's deaths. Marcus Johnson's mother broke down sobbing, finally hearing confirmation of what she had suspected for months, that her son's death hadn't been natural or accidental. Andrew's testimony continued for 2 full days, covering every aspect of Wallace's operation. He described the network of corrupt officers who participated in the abuse, the systematic cover-ups that prevented accountability, and the institutional failures that had allowed Wallace to operate with impunity. He detailed how complaints were buried, how evidence was destroyed, and how witnesses were intimidated into silence. The technical aspects of the investigation were equally compelling. Andrew explained how the recording equipment worked, how transmissions were monitored by federal agents, and how evidence was preserved according to strict chain of custody procedures. Every recording had been authenticated by FBI technicians. Every transmission had been logged and verified, and every piece of evidence had been handled according to protocols that would withstand the most aggressive legal challenges. When it came time for cross-examination, Wallace's attorney attacked Andrew's credibility with the desperation of someone defending the indefensible. Blackwood was known for his aggressive tactics and his ability to confuse juries with technical arguments about police procedures and legal technicalities. Detective Chambers, Blackwood began, "Isn't it true that you lied about your identity for 3 weeks?" "I worked undercover to investigate criminal activity," Andrew replied calmly. "That's a standard and legal investigative technique that's been approved by courts at every level. You deceived not just my client, but dozens of innocent inmates who believed you were one of them," Blackwood pressed, trying to make Andrew appear manipulative and dishonest. "I gathered evidence of systematic civil rights violations that had been hidden from public scrutiny for years," Andrew responded. "Those inmates now have the opportunity to see their abuser face justice. I would argue that they were the beneficiaries, not the victims of my deception." Blackwood tried to characterize Andrew as a rogue officer who had exceeded his authority, suggesting that the investigation had been conducted without proper oversight or legal authorization. But the careful documentation of the investigation's approval and oversight made those attacks ineffective. Every decision had been reviewed by Internal Affairs, coordinated with federal investigators, and conducted according to strict legal guidelines established by decades of precedent. "Isn't it true," Blackwood asked, "that you provoked the confrontations that you claim to have documented?" "I maintained the persona of someone who refused to be completely broken by systematic abuse," Andrew replied. "If that constitutes provocation in your client's mind, it only demonstrates how accustomed he had become to complete submission from his victims." Blackwood spent hours trying to find inconsistencies in Andrew's testimony, challenging his memory of specific events, questioning his interpretation of Wallace's statements, and suggesting that the recordings had been selectively edited to create a false impression. But Andrew had prepared for these attacks, and his responses were consistent, detailed, and supported by comprehensive documentation. The cross-examination continued for hours, but Blackwood was unable to shake Andrews' testimony or undermine the overwhelming evidence that had been gathered during the investigation. Every attack on Andrews' credibility only served to highlight the systematic nature of Wallace's crimes and the desperate lengths his defenders were willing to go to avoid accountability. When Andrew finally stepped down from the witness stand, the prosecution's case was devastating. 3 weeks of recordings, dozens of witness testimonies, and expert analysis of Wallace's psychological torture techniques had created a portrait of corruption so systematic and brutal that even Wallace's most expensive legal representation couldn't find effective defenses. But the revelation that would ultimately seal Wallace's fate came from an unexpected source. During the prosecution's rebuttal case, Agent Jennifer Collins took the stand to testify about the broader investigation that Andrews' undercover work had made possible. Detective Chambers' evidence allowed us to obtain search warrants for Sergeant Wallace's financial records, personal communications, and off-duty activities, Collins testified. What we discovered was a network of corruption that extended far beyond the detention center. The investigation had uncovered a systematic conspiracy involving dozens of officers across multiple jurisdictions. Wallace had been selling information to criminal organizations, taking bribes to ensure certain inmates received special treatment, and coordinating with corrupt prosecutors and judges to ensure that complaints against him were dismissed or buried. We found evidence, Collins continued, that Sergeant Wallace was being paid by organized crime figures to brutalize specific inmates who had cooperated with law enforcement in other cases. This revelation transformed the case from a story about individual corruption to evidence of organized criminal conspiracy. Wallace hadn't just been a rogue officer abusing his authority. He had been a criminal who used his badge to carry out violent retribution on behalf of other criminals. The financial evidence was overwhelming. Bank records showed payments from shell companies linked to known criminal organizations. Phone records documented conversations with crime bosses about specific inmates who needed to be educated about the consequences of cooperation with law enforcement. Surveillance footage showed Wallace meeting with criminals in locations far from his official duties. The final piece of evidence came from Wallace's own communications, intercepted during the federal investigation. Phone calls and text messages revealed his awareness that his actions were criminal, his confidence that institutional protection would shield him from consequences, and his complete lack of remorse for the suffering he had inflicted. "I own this place," Wallace had boasted in one recorded conversation. "These animals get whatever I decide they deserve, and nobody can touch me for it." Another recording captured Wallace's response when a subordinate expressed concern about the brutality. "Conscience is a luxury we can't afford. These people aren't human beings, they're problems that need solutions, and I provide the most permanent solutions available." When the prosecution rested its case, Wallace's defense team made a desperate attempt to portray their client as a dedicated officer who had been overwhelmed by the stress of dealing with dangerous criminals. They called character witnesses who testified about Wallace's reputation in the community, his years of service, and his dedication to law enforcement. But those testimonials only served to make his crimes seem more shocking. The contrast between Wallace's public image and his private behavior demonstrated the calculated nature of his deception and the systematic way he had abused the trust placed in him. Wallace himself chose not to testify, probably because his attorneys knew that cross-examination would only provide prosecutors with additional opportunities to expose his crimes. The decision spoke volumes about the weakness of his defense and the overwhelming nature of the evidence against him. During closing arguments, Prosecutor Martinez stood before the jury and played one final recording, Wallace's voice describing inmates as worthless animals who deserved whatever treatment he chose to inflict. The sound of his laughter while describing someone's suffering filled the courtroom like an indictment of everything he had claimed to represent. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Martinez said, "you have heard 3 weeks of evidence that Sergeant Sean Wallace used his badge not to serve and protect, but to torture and terrorize. He turned a place meant for rehabilitation into his personal chamber of horrors, and he did it with the confidence that his uniform would protect him from accountability." She paused, looking directly at Wallace before continuing. "Detective Andrew Chambers, risked his life to gather this evidence because he believed that no one should be above the law. The question before you is simple. Will you hold Sean Wallace accountable for his crimes, or will you send the message that badges provide immunity for brutality? Wallace's attorney made a final plea for mercy, arguing that his client had been corrupted by a system that placed impossible demands on law enforcement officers. But the jury had heard too much evidence, seen too much documentation, and witnessed too much arrogance to be swayed by appeals for sympathy. After 3 days of deliberation, the jury returned with verdicts that would send shockwaves through law enforcement communities across the country. Guilty on 47 counts of civil rights violations. Guilty on conspiracy charges that would add decades to his sentence. Guilty on charges related to the deaths of Marcus Johnson and Timothy Rodriguez. As the verdicts were read, Wallace's face remained impassive, but his hands shook slightly as he realized that his reign of terror was finally over. Around the courtroom, family members of his victims wept with relief, while law enforcement officials struggled to process the implications of such a comprehensive conviction. The revelation was complete. Sean Wallace's crimes had been exposed, his network dismantled, and his victims vindicated. Justice had finally penetrated the institutional protection that had shielded him for so long, proving that even the most corrupt operations could be brought down by courage, patience, and the unwavering commitment to hold everyone accountable to the law. 3 weeks after the jury delivered their guilty verdicts, Judge Patricia Hawthorne's courtroom was once again packed to capacity for Sean Wallace's sentencing hearing. The atmosphere was different this time. The tension of uncertainty had been replaced by the solemn gravity of Judgment Day. Wallace sat at the defendant's table in his orange jumpsuit, his lawyers having abandoned their earlier confident demeanor for the resigned professionalism of attorneys preparing for the inevitable. Andrew arrived early and took his seat in the gallery, surrounded by the victims and families whose courage in testifying had ensured Wallace's conviction. Jerome Washington sat beside him, having become not just a witness but a friend during the long months of preparation for trial. Behind them, Marcus Johnson's mother held a photograph of her son, while Timothy Rodriguez's family clutched similar mementos of their lost loved one. The pre-sentencing investigation had revealed even more disturbing details about Wallace's criminal enterprise. Federal investigators had uncovered bank accounts in foreign countries, real estate purchased with criminal proceeds, and evidence of corruption that extended into other law enforcement agencies. The man who had terrorized inmates for 15 years had also been living far beyond his official salary, accumulating wealth through a systematic pattern of criminal activity that made his badge crimes seem almost secondary to his broader criminal career. "All rise," announced the bailiff as Judge Hawthorne entered the courtroom. She had spent the past 3 weeks reviewing hundreds of pages of victim impact statements, psychological evaluations, and sentencing recommendations from federal prosecutors who were seeking the maximum penalty allowed under law. Judge Hawthorne had built her career on the principle that justice required both mercy and accountability. But the evidence in Wallace's case had tested even her commitment to measured punishment. The systematic nature of his crimes, the vulnerability of his victims, and the breach of public trust he represented demanded a response that would send a clear message about the consequences of such profound corruption. "Before I pronounce sentence," Judge Hawthorne began, "I want to hear from the victims whose lives were forever changed by the defendant's actions. Mr. Washington, would you like to address the court?" Jerome stood slowly, his hands trembling slightly as he approached the podium. For months, he had been preparing for this moment, the opportunity to speak directly to the man who had tormented him and to ensure that Wallace understood the full impact of his crimes. "Your Honor," Jerome began, his voice steady despite the emotion clearly visible in his eyes, "Sean Wallace didn't just hurt my body, he tried to destroy my soul. For 8 months, I lived in constant fear, never knowing when the next beating would come, never knowing if I would survive to see my family again." Jerome's words filled the courtroom with the weight of authentic suffering, the kind of testimony that transformed abstract legal concepts into human reality. But what hurt the most wasn't the violence, it was the way he made me feel like I didn't matter, like my life had no value, like I was less than human because of the color of my skin. Wallace remained motionless at the defendant's table, staring straight ahead as Jerome continued his statement. His lawyers had probably advised him to show remorse, to demonstrate some understanding of the harm he had caused. But Wallace's rigid posture suggested either defiance or complete disconnection from the consequences of his actions. "I want to thank Detective Chambers," Jerome continued, turning toward Andrew in the gallery. "He showed me that not all police officers are like Wallace, that some people are willing to risk everything to protect those who can't protect themselves. Because of his courage, I can sleep at night knowing that Wallace will never hurt anyone else." As Jerome returned to his seat, Marcus Johnson's mother stood to deliver her victim impact statement. Dorothy Johnson was a small woman whose quiet dignity had made her one of the most compelling witnesses during the trial. She approached the podium, carrying the photograph of her son that had become a symbol of Wallace's most serious crimes. "Marcus was my baby," she said, her voice breaking with grief that hadn't diminished in the months since his death. "He was 26 years old, full of life, planning to get married when he got out of jail. He was serving 60 days for a minor drug charge, 60 days that turned into a death sentence because of what that man did to him." She pointed directly at Wallace, her fingers shaking with rage and sorrow. "The coroner said Marcus died of a heart attack, but I know better. I saw the bruises on his body, the fear in his eyes during our last visit. Sean Wallace murdered my son as surely as if he had put a gun to his head." Dorothy Johnson's words seemed to penetrate Wallace's defensive armor in a way that months of legal proceedings hadn't. For the first time since the trial began, he appeared to be genuinely affected by the testimony, his face showing signs of the emotional impact he had managed to suppress throughout the trial. "I don't want revenge," Dorothy continued, her voice growing stronger. "I want justice. I want to make sure that no other mother has to go through what I've gone through. No other family has to wonder what really happened to their loved one in police custody." The victim impact statements continued for over an hour, with 12 different people describing how Wallace's crimes had affected their lives. Some were former inmates who had survived his abuse. Others were family members who had watched their loved ones deteriorate under his systematic torture. Each statement added another layer to the comprehensive picture of harm that Wallace's criminal enterprise had inflicted on the community. Carlos Mendez, the immigrant who still walked with a limp from Wallace's beatings, spoke about the permanent physical damage that would affect him for the rest of his life. Deshaun Williams, the young man who had attempted suicide after Wallace's psychological torture, described his ongoing struggle with depression and post-traumatic stress. Robert Taylor, the elderly veteran who had been denied medical care, explained how Wallace's abuse had reactivated trauma from his military service that he had spent decades learning to manage. The cumulative impact of these statements was devastating. Wallace hadn't just committed individual acts of violence. He had systematically destroyed lives, shattered families, and corrupted the very institution he was sworn to serve. The evidence of harm extended far beyond the specific charges he had been convicted of, revealing a pattern of cruelty that had affected dozens of people over years of unchecked abuse. When the victim's statements concluded, Prosecutor Sarah Martinez stood to present the government's sentencing recommendation. The federal sentencing guidelines suggested a range of 45 to 55 years in prison, but Martinez was asking for the maximum sentence allowed under law, life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. "Your Honor," Martinez began, "the defendant's crimes represent one of the most systematic and brutal patterns of police corruption this court has ever seen. He didn't make mistakes in judgment or lose control in moments of stress. He created and operated a criminal enterprise that used the power of law enforcement to terrorize vulnerable people." Martinez methodically reviewed the evidence that had been presented during the trial, emphasizing the calculated nature of Wallace's crimes and the sophistication of the corruption network he had built. The defendant didn't just abuse his authority, he perverted it into something fundamentally evil, turning the badge into a weapon of oppression rather than a symbol of protection. The prosecutor then addressed the broader implications of Wallace's crimes for law enforcement and public trust. When officers like the defendant commit such systematic abuse, they damage not just their immediate victims, but the entire profession of law enforcement. They make it harder for good officers to do their jobs. They erode public confidence in the justice system and they create the kind of cynicism about law enforcement that takes generations to repair. Martinez concluded her remarks by emphasizing the need for a sentence that would send a clear message about accountability. The defendant has shown no remorse for his crimes, no understanding of the harm he has caused, and no indication that he would behave differently if given another opportunity. The only appropriate sentence is one that ensures he never again has the chance to abuse anyone. Wallace's defense attorney, Richard Blackwood, then stood to present his sentencing argument. Despite the overwhelming evidence of his client's guilt, Blackwood was obligated to argue for the most lenient sentence possible under the circumstances. "Your Honor," Blackwood began, "my client stands convicted of serious crimes, and he must face the consequences of his actions. But I would ask the court to consider the context in which these crimes occurred, the impossible pressures faced by correctional officers, the dehumanizing environment of detention facilities, and the institutional failures that allowed these problems to develop." Blackwood's argument attempted to shift blame from Wallace to the broader system of mass incarceration, suggesting that his client had been corrupted by an environment that inevitably led to abuse. Sean Wallace didn't create the conditions that led to these crimes. He was victimized by a system that places officers in situations where abuse becomes normalized and accountability becomes impossible. The defense attorney also presented character testimony from Wallace's family members, former colleagues, and community members who described a different version of the man who had been convicted of such horrific crimes. His ex-wife testified about his struggles with stress and alcohol. His former partner described the pressures of working in dangerous environments, and his pastor spoke about his contributions to charitable causes in the community. But these testimonials seemed hollow in the context of the overwhelming evidence of systematic cruelty that had been presented during the trial. The contrast between Wallace's public persona and his criminal behavior only served to emphasize the calculated nature of his deception and the sophistication of the facade he had maintained while committing his crimes. Judge Hawthorne listened to all the arguments with the careful attention that had made her one of the most respected federal judges in the district. When the presentations concluded, she announced that she would take a brief recess to consider her decision before pronouncing sentence. During the 30-minute break, Andrew found himself surrounded by victims and family members who wanted to thank him for his role in bringing Wallace to justice. The conversations were emotional and profound, with people expressing gratitude not just for his courage in going undercover, but for his willingness to believe that their suffering mattered enough to risk everything to document it. "You gave us our voices back," said Maria Rodriguez, Timothy's sister, as she shook Andrew's hand. "For so long, we felt like no one was listening, like no one cared what happened to people like Timothy. You showed us that someone was willing to fight for justice." Jerome Washington approached Andrew with tears in his eyes. "Man, I don't know how to thank you. You literally saved my life in there, and you saved the lives of everyone who would have been Wallace's victims after us." When court reconvened, Judge Hawthorne took her place at the bench with an expression that revealed nothing about the decision she was about to announce. The courtroom fell silent as she began to speak, understanding that the next few minutes would determine whether justice would truly be served in this case. "Mr. Wallace," Judge Hawthorne said, looking directly at the defendant, "please stand." Wallace rose slowly, flanked by his attorneys, his face showing no emotion as he prepared to hear his fate. The moment had finally arrived when he would learn the consequences of 15 years of systematic brutality and corruption. "In my 23 years on the federal bench," Judge Hawthorne began, "I have never encountered a case that more thoroughly violated the fundamental principles of justice, human dignity, and public trust. Your crimes represent not just individual acts of violence, but a systematic perversion of law enforcement that strikes at the very heart of our constitutional system." The judge paused, allowing her words to settle over the courtroom before continuing. "You took an oath to serve and protect, but instead you chose to terrorize and brutalize. You were given a badge as a symbol of authority, but you used it as a weapon of oppression. You were entrusted with the care of vulnerable people, but you made them the victims of your sadistic cruelty." Judge Hawthorne then addressed the specific crimes for which Wallace had been convicted, emphasizing the systematic nature of his abuse and the vulnerability of his victims. The evidence shows that you targeted people based on their race, their perceived weakness, and their inability to defend themselves. You created a reign of terror that lasted for years and affected dozens of innocent people. The judge also addressed the broader implications of Wallace's crimes for law enforcement and public trust. Your actions have damaged not just your immediate victims, but the entire profession of law enforcement. You have made it harder for honest officers to do their jobs, and you have contributed to a climate of distrust that undermines the effectiveness of the justice system. Finally, Judge Hawthorne turned to the question of appropriate punishment. The federal sentencing guidelines recommend a sentence of 45 to 55 years in prison, but those guidelines cannot adequately capture the scope and systematic nature of your crimes, the vulnerability of your victims, or the profound breach of public trust you represent. The courtroom held its breath as Judge Hawthorne prepared to announce the sentence that would determine Wallace's fate. Therefore, she continued, I sentence you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, to be served in federal custody. Additionally, I am ordering you to pay restitution in the amount of $2 million to your victims and their families, and I am recommending that you be placed in protective custody for your own safety. The announcement sent a wave of emotion through the courtroom. Victims and family members wept with relief and satisfaction, while Wallace's family members struggled to process the finality of the sentence. Wallace himself remained stoic, but the slight tremor in his hands revealed that the reality of spending the rest of his life in prison had finally penetrated his defensive facade. Furthermore, Judge Hawthorne continued, I am recommending that this case serve as a catalyst for comprehensive reform of correctional facilities throughout this district. The institutional failures that allowed these crimes to continue for so long must be addressed to prevent future tragedies. As Wallace was led away in handcuffs for the last time, Andrew felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Justice had been served, but the cost had been enormous, not just for Wallace's victims, but for the entire law enforcement community that would have to rebuild trust in the wake of such profound corruption. Outside the courthouse, Andrew was surrounded by reporters wanting to know his thoughts on the sentence and the broader implications of the case. He chose his words carefully, understanding that his statements would be scrutinized by law enforcement agencies across the country. This case proves that no one is above the law, Andrew said, looking directly into the cameras. Badges don't provide immunity for brutality, and institutional protection cannot shield criminals from accountability forever. But it also proves that the system can work when good people are willing to risk everything to ensure that justice is served. Jerome Washington approached Andrew as the crowd of reporters began to disperse. What happens now? He asked, his voice reflecting both relief and uncertainty about the future. Now we make sure this never happens again, Andrew replied, shaking Jerome's hand with the firm grip of someone who understood that their work was far from over. We use this case as a foundation for real reform, real accountability, and real change in how law enforcement treats the people it's supposed to protect. As Andrew walked away from the courthouse that day, he thought about the long journey that had brought him to this moment. 3 weeks of systematic abuse, months of preparation for trial, and a year of legal proceedings had finally culminated in justice for Wallace's victims. But more importantly, the case had established precedents that would make it easier to investigate and prosecute similar crimes in the future. The recording device that had captured Wallace's crimes was now part of legal history, demonstrating the power of technology to document abuse and hold criminals accountable. The investigation techniques that Andrew had used would be studied and replicated by law enforcement agencies around the world, and the courage of victims like Jerome Washington in coming forward to testify would inspire others to speak out against injustice. Sean Wallace would spend the rest of his life in federal prison, experiencing firsthand the powerlessness he had inflicted on so many others. His network of corrupt associates would face their own prosecutions, ensuring that the entire criminal enterprise would be dismantled, and the institutional reforms that Judge Hawthorne had recommended would help prevent future tragedies from occurring. But perhaps most importantly, the case had sent a clear message that accountability was possible, that justice could penetrate even the most protected corridors of power, and that ordinary people willing to do extraordinary things could change the world for the better. As Andrew drove home that evening, he thought about his daughter Maya and the world he was helping to create for her generation. It would be a world where badges truly meant protection rather than threat, where justice applied equally regardless of race or economic status, and where corrupt officers could not hide behind institutional protection when they betrayed their oaths. The hunt was over, the predator had been captured, and justice had finally been served. But the real victory wasn't the conviction of one corrupt officer. It was the proof that the system could hold itself accountable, that good could triumph over evil, and that sometimes the hunter and the hunted could change places when courage and determination met the pursuit of justice. Have you ever stood up for what's right, even when it felt impossible? Have you witnessed accountability triumph over corruption in your community? Share your thoughts on how we can continue building a justice system that truly serves everyone. If stories like this inspire you to believe in the possibility of real change, like this video and subscribe to Color of Justice. Help us continue telling stories that matter, stories that document both the persistence of injustice and the power of accountability to create lasting transformation. Your support helps ensure that these important stories reach people who need to see that change is possible, that dignity and courage can overcome systematic oppression, and that justice, though sometimes delayed, can ultimately prevail.